Hopefully these series of clips having to do with my old house in general, and regarding my house heater in particular, have not been too confusing. Because if they have, then be prepared to get even more confused, especially with the clips I'm including with this narration, which were filmed over a 2-day period. They were about the exact same thing, yet they were not all filmed on the same day. I'll call them Day 1 and Day 2. Some things filmed on Day 2, I'm talking about what took place on Day 1. I'll show you what I mean. This clip was filmed on Day 1. Here's the heater, and I'll be tracing some of the radiator lines and one of the lines is this line right here, and then it's better for me to just stand over here. One of the lines is this line right here, and the other line is this line here. Okay, so those are two radiator lines. One is feed and the other one is return. Now as they go up, they come together here and here. So those are the two lines that I had pointed out in a previous segment. And then they are coming down over the area of the hot water heater, the washer, and then they pass this wall here, continue on down, and they make a turn here. Yep, you can see them coming down. Until they get to this particular area here where they had been cut, and after they were cut, the ends of the pipes were unscrewed, and as I pointed out, one of them has a really bad inside cut. I have these two plugs, which I had demonstrated before. To put inside here. So in addition to those, I'll be using these things here. This is the more robust version of Teflon tape, which is a bit more thicker. And I'll be using that, and I'll also be using this Gasoila or Gasoila. This is pipe dope, and this is what Henry had asked Frank the plumber what he used. So I'll be using a combination of the tape and the pipe dope on those two plugs. Then the question had become, once I take a wrench to these plugs, how tightly do I tighten them up? I mean, do I tighten them as hard as I can and run the risk of damaging or cracking the connectors, which I'm tightening them into, or do I tighten them just snug? Because as far as I know, these are the only two areas of this radiator system in which water is leaking. As I explained before, water was leaking in the floor of the kitchen. And in this particular area, I would say they did a good job of putting these connectors here, which allowed us to just simply cut them and then unscrew the fittings, eventually getting them out. And this, if this is successful, then the house will be able to, I'll be able to go over to the heater, turn the water on, and by successful I mean I'll make this tight enough so it doesn't leak out of either one of these plugs. But it won't be too tight that it cracks any of the fittings or damages any of them that the plugs are plugged into. Next you see me on day 2 with a more abbreviated version of what you just saw. Over there is where the house heater is located at, which I'll get to in a second. But first I wanted to direct your attention to this area here where the radiator pipes were cut. I go back to day 1 in which I am prepping the plugs with tape. I stick with day 1. I finish prepping the plugs with pipe dope and tightening them with a wrench. Stuff is thick. This tape is coming off. Most of what follows was recorded on day 2, in which I am describing what took place on day 1. I had 2 separate devices recording simultaneously. The first was a camcorder which I had stationary recording aimed at these 2 plugs. The reason being, when I went down to the heater and opened up the valve, if water began shooting out of these, or at the very least, it started leaking, then I would be able to capture that as it happened. The other device I had was my iPad, which I had handheld with me as I walked down to the heater. There are 2 valves associated with this house heater, an upper valve and a lower valve. The upper valve is located right here. This valve, when open, serves to fill up the house heater with water. It also fills up the radiator lines with water as well. This lower valve here serves, when open, to drain the house heater of water as well as drain all the radiator lines throughout. You may recall in a previous video when I was repeatedly emptying buckets of water until the system was completely drained. With the stationary camcorder aimed at the sealed plugs, I opened up this valve all the way, and I could hear the system filling up with water. The first thing that happened was water began gushing out of this drain valve here, because when I had emptied the system earlier, I forgot to close it, so I closed it. The next thing that happened after that was nothing. So I think you get the gist of what the 2 different day clips consist of. Day 1 was when everything which happened happened. On day 2 was when I came back to describe the events which took place on day 1. So, why do it this way? You may wonder. Why not simply film everything which went on in day one, then upload it to my channel, instead of all of this day two crosstalk describing what took place on day one? Well, that's exactly what I did. I filmed everything on day one. However, the majority of the important footage was filmed with my iPad. The same iPad I have had for the past 8 years and has worked flawlessly. Well, I found out the hard way that what was once flawless before is not quite as flawless anymore. Before I can upload any clips to the YouTube you are watching, I first have to transfer the footage from my iPad to my PC for uploading. And that's where things fell apart. Any type of files you have are the most vulnerable when you are transferring them from one place to another, because something can happen to them. You have the option of doing it one of two ways. You can copy the files, or you can move them. Copying them is always the safest bet, because that way if something happens to the copied, you still have the originals in their original place to try it again. That was not the way I did it. Because for those of you who have followed this series from the beginning, know that early on I ran into issues with filming due to lack of space on my iPad. So I figured, since it has been flawless during moving files off it, I'll move them instead of copying first. It just so happens that was the time when the files decided to get corrupted. I ended up losing valuable footage which occurred as things were filmed real time, so I could not do them over again. All I could do was come back another day and describe what took place the day before. So although it was a hugely successful day as far as the two plugs working the way I hoped they would, the same could not be said of my video footage. The main segment which survived was of the stationary camera pointing at the sealed plugs, while the exciting stuff was happening down where I was at the heater with my iPad. Okay, let's go down here and take a look at the plugs and see how they're doing. You can even hear me come back to the stationary camera and comment on how positively things turned out. Okay, now I'm back at the plugs, and they appear to not be leaking, which is amazing. I expect to have at least some leaks in it. So let me take a walk out throughout the house and see if I have any other open areas that I hadn't thought of yet. I ended up calling Henry and giving him an update over the phone because of how he had been so instrumental in my reaching the point I eventually got to. Whereas it would have been better to simply have had all the footage maintained, uploaded, and then say, Henry, go watch this outcome. Needless to say, from now on, greater care will be taken when handling my video files.